We've seen how markets work when outside factors change the demand or supply of a good or service. Now let's see what effects that has on the equilibrium price and quantity of a good. Let's say that some factor causes the demand for a good to increase. If this happens, the intersection of the new demand curve with the supply curve occurs at a higher price and a higher quantity. The market moves from the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium using the same mechanisms as I described in a previous video. Now that more people want this good, buyers will bid up the price. Sellers, seeing this higher price, will produce more. This will continue until the quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. All in all, an increase in the demand for a good will shift the curve to the right and result in a higher equilibrium quantity and price. Conversely, if demand decreases, then the exact opposite happens. The new demand curve, D2, intersects the supply curve at a lower price point and a lower quantity, thus the equilibrium price falls and the equilibrium quantity falls. The effects of a change in supply can also be deduced quite intuitively. If producers begin producing more at every price, let's say because more producers have entered the market, then we can say that the supply of the good in question has increased. More and more of the good is being offered for sale, and sellers can't sell all their inventory at the original equilibrium price, thus sellers begin to lower their prices until a point at which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. This is shown on the graph as the intersection of the new supply curve with the demand curve. With an increase in supply, we can see that equilibrium price falls and the equilibrium quantity rises. A decrease in supply has the exact opposite effects of an increase in supply. The equilibrium price increases and the equilibrium quantity decreases. In the world of economics, we often use the ceteris paribus assumption, meaning that we hold everything else constant. A lot of times, supply and demand both shift at the same time. If they both shift in the same direction, we can make certain predictions. There will be certain things that I will mention right now that I haven't posted on the slides. I want you to try and visualize what I'm talking about when I do that. I'll let you know what I'm talking about when we get there. If both supply and demand shift in the same direction, they can both either increase or decrease. Let's say that they both increase. In this situation, regardless of how much supply and demand shift, we can clearly see that the quantity will definitely increase. Here's the part where you'll need to visualize the changes in supply and demand in your head, or maybe even draw the graph yourself if need be. You might be wondering, what if the curves don't shift by the same amount? Well, if the supply curve shifts to the right more than the demand curve shifts to the right, then we can say that the equilibrium price has decreased. Conversely, if demand increases more than supply increases, we would observe an increase in the equilibrium price. If both supply and demand increase by the same amount, then the equilibrium price would remain unchanged. On the graph, I've only drawn the situation in which the price has remained unchanged, but I want to emphasize the fact that it is quite rare that both the curves shift by the same amount. The point here is that if both supply and demand increase, we know for sure that the equilibrium quantity will increase. We'll have to see exactly how much supply and demand have each increased to figure out what the effect on price would be. On the other hand, if supply and demand decrease, we would expect to see a decrease in the quantity. And again, we would have to know the exact amount by which each curve shifted in order to determine the overall effect on price. If demand and supply move in opposite directions, then things change a little bit. Let's observe a situation in which demand increases, but supply decreases. In this case, we can clearly see that no matter how much demand increases and no matter how much supply decreases, the equilibrium price would increase. However, we don't know what happens to the equilibrium quantity just yet. Try to visualize this in your head, or draw it out if you need. If demand increases more than supply decreases, then the equilibrium quantity would increase. On the other hand, if supply decreases more than demand increases, the equilibrium quantity would decrease. Again, either way, the price would still increase. On the other hand, if demand decreases and supply increases, we would be able to infer that the equilibrium price would decrease. However, again, we would need more information on how much the demand and supply curves have shifted in order to determine the overall effect on the equilibrium quantity.